In the last episode, we cracked open the hero. Today, we stay in the same quadrant, but we shift the method completely. The magician also belongs to the change the world quadrant. Same direction, but a different engine. The change the world quadrant powers brands that refuse to accept reality as it is, runs on ambition, challenge, and the conviction that progress requires friction. But inside that quadrant, there are three archetypes doing the work, and each one, it moves differently. The hero confronts adversity through capability and discipline. The rebel, which we'll cover in the future, challenges through defiance and disruption. And the magician, and this is where we're spending the next 20 minutes, transforms reality through understanding. That's the distinction that matters. The hero changes the world by outworking it. The rebel changes it by refusing it. The magician changes it by revealing it. So if you're a leader trying to decide whether your brand lives in this territory, the question isn't whether you want to change something, it's how. The method tells you everything. So let's get into an overview and the motivations behind the magician archetype. Here's where the magician gets flattened the fastest. Most people hear the word and they think mystique, they think creativity, they think a little bit of sparkle and a lot of whimsy, magical potions and explosions, whatever. That's not the magician archetype. That is the costume agencies put on the magician when they don't understand what it actually is. The real magician archetype has nothing to do with the spectacle. It's rooted in one of the oldest human impulses there is, the desire to understand how the world works, and the belief that understanding can reshape reality. The magician masters systems, not people, systems. It looks beneath the surface, finds the underlying pattern, and uses that insight to create transformation. Think about who filled this role across history. Healers who understood herbal medicine, navigators who understood the stars, scientists, scholars, physicians, inventors. Their power came from understanding forces other people couldn't grasp. That's the magician lineage. Insight, not illusion. The psychological mechanism underneath it is reframing. Cognitive psychologists have been writing about this for decades. Humans don't experience the world through pure observation. We experience it through interpretation. Everything we perceive gets filtered through mental models that define what something means. Change the frame, you change the reaction. Change the reaction, you change the behavior. The magician archetype is reframing in brand form. Magician brands don't persuade, they reveal. Jung described the magician as a figure who operates between consciousness and the unconscious, translating insight into action. That's exactly the motivational posture. The magician pursues knowledge not as an end, but as a pathway to transformation. Understanding is the currency. Transformation is the deliverable. And this is where the quadrant distinction sharpens. Heroes empower people through effort. Magicians empower people through insight. Both are about making the patron stronger. But the hero says, do this hard thing and you'll be transformed. The magician says, see this thing differently and you'll be transformed. One uses the muscle, the other uses the mind. Both change the world. Neither one is the other. There's also a research backing here worth naming. Studies on meaning. Studies on meaning making show that humans create psychological coherence by linking events to interpretive narratives. When events lack meaning, we feel anxious. When meaning gets supplied, anxiety drops and action becomes possible. The magician brands tap directly into that mechanism. They give patrons a new way to interpret themselves, their problems, or their potential. And once meaning changes, everything else changes with it. That's the archetype. Mastery of systems, reframing as method, transformation as outcome. As with all archetypes, there are strengths, so let's talk about those. What does the magician archetype do well? First, wisdom and insight. Magician brands see what everyone else is missing. They synthesize patterns and connections that stay invisible to the rest of the category. And because the brand speaks to underlying motivations instead of surface level features, patrons feel understood in a way competitors can't replicate. Wisdom becomes a form of intimacy. The brand anticipates the market instead of chasing it. The second strength that magician archetypes have is transformation. This is the core of the archetype. Magician brands take patrons from one state to another, more capable, more confident, more whole. People don't just buy from a magician brand, they evolve through it. Every product becomes a chapter in a larger story of becoming. That's emotionally sticky in a way featured comparison never really will be. People remember the brands that change them. Fact. The third strength here is visionary thinking. Magician brands think expansively. They don't ask how to improve what exists. They ask how to reimagine it. That mindset produces offerings that feel ahead of their time or perfectly matched to what the world is about to need. Internally, it creates a culture where teams are allowed to think in terms of what could be rather than what is. Vision becomes the operating system. The fourth strength is healing and restoration. Magician brands restore what's been diminished. Clarity where there was confusion. Empowerment where there was insecurity. Possibility where there was stagnation. This doesn't have to be literal therapy. It can be the emotional relief of a simpler experience or a product that dissolves a persistent frustration. Patrons walk away from a magician brand feeling better than they did before they engaged. That emotional lift deepens loyalty. The fifth strength is mastery. This is the magician's source of authority. These brands are not dabblers. They're experts. Execution is precise, intentional, and refined. Mastery signals depth. It proves the brand understands not just what it's doing, but why. That level of skill creates emotional security for the patron and builds equity over time that competitors cannot fake. 5 strengths: wisdom, transformation, vision, healing, and mastery. Notice what's not on the list. Mystery isn't a strength. Complexity is not a strength. Cleverness isn't a strength. The magician earns its power by converting complexity into clarity, not by hiding behind it. As with all archetypes, there are strengths, but there are the opposite of strengths, the weaknesses. Some people call them shadow archetypes. Which brings us to this section. Every archetype has one or multiple, and the magicians are particularly seductive. You want to avoid these traits. The first weakness is illusion over substance. The magician is a master of perception, and that mastery turns into a liability when the brand leans on symbolism and visionary language without building the real value underneath. Storytelling becomes a smokescreen for the weak offerings. Customers are captivated for a minute, then the experience doesn't match the promise, and the mystique hurtles into deception. A mirage that evaporates when you look at it closely. The second weakness is elitist insight. Depth of knowledge can slip into superiority. The brand starts speaking in ways that feel coded or inaccessible or even condescending. Insight becomes a velvet rope. When a magician positions itself as enlightened rather than enlightening, it creates emotional distance. Patrons admire from a distance but don't feel invited to participate. It's a huge miss. The third weakness is detachment from reality. Vision can drift into untethered aspiration. The brand articulates extraordinary futures it has no operational capacity to deliver. Customers feel the gap quickly. What was inspiring starts to feel impractical. The magician becomes the brand that dreams beautifully and executes poorly. Imagination without execution is just disillusionment waiting to happen. The fourth weakness is dependency on inspiration. Inspiration is unpredictable. When a brand leans on moments of creative spark instead of disciplined systems, the output gets inconsistent. Peaks of brilliance, long valleys of nothing. Patrons notice, the brand becomes unreliable rather than magical. Inspiration is a catalyst. It is not a strategy. The fifth weakness I want to pull out is overcomplication. Magicians love depth. That love becomes a problem when it produces messaging, products, or experiences that feel overly intricate. People appreciate the beauty of the idea, but can't figure out the relevance. Overcomplication is the shadow side of intelligence. It replaces clarity with cleverness and alienates every patrons and teams alike. So the shadow, illusion, elitism, detachment, inconsistency, and complication. If you're building a magician brand, this is the list you audit against constantly. Every weakness here is a version of the same root problem, valuing how things feel more than what they do. The magician archetype collapses when it forgets the transformation has to be real, grounded, and actually delivered. So how's this come to life out there in the world? Let's put 3 brands on the table that express this archetype in different ways. Same archetype, different territories, and that's really the point. First one is Snickers. Snickers might surprise you as a magician example because the brand is so mass and playful. But look at what it actually does. The campaign, "You're not you when you're hungry," is pure cognitive reframing. It takes a common physical experience, hunger, and reinterprets it as a shift in identity. Now you're not just snacking, you're recovering yourself, returning to your true state. That's magician psychology applied to a candy bar. Snickers doesn't compete on ingredients. It doesn't compete on flavor. It competes on meaning. It offers transformation from not you back to you. And it delivers that transformation in a form that feels immediate and believable. A small shift, but a big effect. The magician archetype doesn't have to be mystical. Sometimes it's a chocolate bar that tells you who you are again. The next one is kind of easy, but it's important to call out, and that is Red Bull. Red Bull positions itself as a catalyst for transformation of state. Fatigue to capability. That's the entire proposition. The brand barely talks about flavor or ingredients. Every piece of communication points at state change. Athletes jumping out of the stratosphere, cliff divers, Formula One. These aren't product demos, they're evidence of transformation. The psychology underneath it is state-dependent performance. Your energy level directly shapes your confidence, your focus, and your physical output. Red Bull ties the brand to that shift. It doesn't use a spectacle to entertain, it uses spectacle as proof. The message is always the same. This unlocks potential. This expands what you're capable. Transformation is the product. The third example I want to call it is Spanx. Spanx is the most interesting of the 3 because the transformation is inside the patron itself, not outside, unlike the other 2. Spanx doesn't promise invisibility. It promises a shift in how a person feels when they get dressed. That shift influences posture, communication, presence, everything that follows from self-perception. Research in psychology consistently shows that how people see themselves shapes how they behave. Spanx taps that connection directly. The product becomes a tool for empowerment rather than concealment. The transformation is real, visible, and behavioral. And Spanx pulls it off without the theatrics. Practical outcome, psychological significance. That's the magician archetype applied to apparel without a single wand or robe in sight. 3 brands, a candy bar, an energy drink, and a shapewear company. All magician brands, all delivering transformation through a different kind of reframing. That's the range of the archetype when it's done well. If you're leading a brand and you're testing whether the magician fits, the question to sit with is this: can your brand actually change what patrons believe is possible for themselves and the world around them? Not claim to do it, not gesture at it, but actually deliver it. Because if the answer is yes, and you can prove it with real mastery underneath the story, the magician gives you one of the most powerful emotional positions in branding. People remember the brands that changed them. They carry those brands forward because the transformation becomes a part of their self-story. If the answer is no, and the transformation is more aesthetic than operational, the archetype will collapse on illusion without substance, vision without execution, a mirage that evaporates the second a patron looks closely. In the next episode, we close out the Change the World quadrant with the Rebel, the archetype that changes the world by refusing it, the defiance engine, the one everyone thinks they are. Until then, that's the Magician. Hopefully you enjoyed this and got a lot of value, and hopefully I was able to reframe your perceptions of the Magician archetype away from the Merlins of the world and the robes and the wands and the alchemy, and more into the psychological driver. Magicians change the world through knowledge and changing the perceptions and the reframing of the story and all. That's what makes a magician so, magical. And hopefully you can find ways to integrate this into your brand strategies. As always, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for commenting, liking, subscribing, all of that. Please do share this. It really helps get the word out there. Until next time.